Welcome back to our From Idea to App series. This is part 3, where we are going to dive straight into using data from external APIs as part of your application. In the previous 2 parts of this series, we have gone through and set up our entire backend from scratch in Xano. We've added some data to our application, and we've even built some APIs to power the functionality of our application. But we have a little bit of a problem. The purpose of the app that we're building is to provide local restaurant deals in your area. Now, in the previous examples, we were just populating data by hand, which is obviously not very practical, and you will likely find yourself in a similar situation as you are building your application. To solve this problem, we want to leverage an external API that can populate our database with all sorts of restaurants that might be in a user's local area. To do that, we will be using the API from Spoonacular. There's a ton of functionality that comes from this API, but the one that we are going to leverage today is a restaurant search based on location. The first thing you're going to want to do is sign up for an account. So we'll just click Start Now and fill in our information. We will accept the terms and conditions and click Sign Up. So now that we've signed up, verified our email, and logged in, we are taken to our API console. And the first thing we're going to want to do here is we're going to go to our profile, and we need this API key. We're going to need this for every request that we make to this API. So I'm going to show my API key, and I'm just going to copy it. In Xano, I'm going to go over to my settings on the left-hand side, and what I want to do is I want to store that API key somewhere so I can easily refer back to it in my function stacks. So in this environment variables option, I'm going to click this blue manage button, and I'm going to add a variable. I'm going to call this API key, and I'm just going to paste that key in there and click save. And so what this will let me do is now I can refer to that value as a variable in any of my Xano function stacks. We'll show you how that works in just a second. Let's go back to Spoonacular, and what we want to do is we want to look at their documentation. The documentation for an external API is going to be what tells you how to use it. Let's find the API that we want to use. So it looks like we have recipes, ingredients, products, menu items, meal planning, and finally restaurants. So we have a search restaurants API. An API request has a few very standard things that you're going to want to keep an eye out for. The first is the request URL. So this is the link that we are actually calling when we make the API request. We have some parameters that may be required for that request to execute successfully. And then the documentation will usually have an example request and response in some form. So this is an example request URL, and this is an example of the response that the API would return. So we can kind of get an idea of what this API is actually going to provide to us. We are going to call this API to get a list of restaurants, and we're going to transform and manipulate that data so we can populate our own restaurants database with that same information. So to make this super simple, I'm just going to copy their example URL here, and we'll go back to Xano, and let's create a new API. So I'm going to click Add API Endpoint. I'm going to start from scratch. I'm going to say Populate Restaurants is my title, and we'll save that. And so now in our function stack, the first thing we need to do is we need to add a request to that API. So that's going to be the external API request function. Some APIs will provide what is called a curl command. If they do, you can use this import curl option to paste that in there, and Xano will automatically populate all of the information here that we need. But it looks like for this, we'd need to do a little bit of building from scratch, which is okay. It's not difficult, I promise. So the first thing we want to do is we just want to paste the URL into the URL box. Again, that was from the documentation. This is their example request URL here. And let's go ahead and expand this just to see what we have here. So we have the URL to Spoonacular, and then it looks like we are defining a cuisine, and we are specifying a latitude and a longitude. Now, I'm not seeing anything else that is necessarily required for this to run. There's probably some authentication that we need to do, but let's go ahead and save this. And I'm just going to go ahead and run it for now. And it looks like we received an error. So we have a status failure, code 401, you are not authorized. It gives us a link to the authentication documentation. So let's take a look at that and see what the API expects in terms of authentication. So it says to use your API, you need an API key, which we already have and we stored in our Xano environment variables. And it looks like this is just specified via a URL parameter. So we can go back to Xano, and that just means that we need to edit our request to include that API key right here in the URL. So we're going to do that by placing an ampersand. It looks like the key is called API key with a capital K. So let's go ahead and add that. And we'll put equals, and I'm going to just put replace me at the end of this. And what that will allow us to do is we'll use a filter called replace to search for replace me in that URL and dynamically replace it with our API key from the environment variables. So we'll save that one more time, and let's run this again, and we'll see what we get. So the request was technically successful, but it looks like we weren't actually returned any restaurants. So let's pick a different location. Okay, so I have modified my request URL to update this with a new location. Let's go ahead and save that. And we will run our request one more time. Okay, so it looks like we have some restaurant data. Very cool. Let's scroll back up here and we'll see how many restaurants we were actually returned. So it looks like they gave us 99 restaurants that matched our location and cuisine query. Now the goal for this is to take this data of 99 restaurants, transform and manipulate it as we need to, pull the exact data that we need out of it, and insert it into our table. Typically, when an API returns multiple results to you, the first thing we need to do is we need to build a loop. So we're going to use a for each loop for this, which is designed to just iterate over an entire list of items. So let's go ahead and set up our for each loop. Now we need to tell the for each loop where our list of results is. Now there is a way to kind of do this a little bit easier, but I want to walk through it manually at least once just to make sure we understand the concept. So we're going to point this to our API1 variable, which is where that response is being stored. But the list does not live at the base level of this data. We need to pinpoint exactly where the list of restaurants is so the loop knows what to run through. So that is going to be under our response. We can see that's the first key here. So I'm going to put a dot and I'm going to type response. And we'll go ahead and expand that. And it looks like we have result. So I'm going to put a dot result. And then we have restaurants. So we'll put dot restaurants. Now I know that this is where I can stop because if we collapse restaurants, you can see that this is an array, which is denoted by these square brackets here. And that is what actually contains the restaurant data. So that is the list that our loop needs to iterate through. So we don't need to add anything else here. And we'll go ahead and save that. The first thing that I like to do when I'm building loops in Xano is I like to leverage a stop and debug function. Stop and debug allows me to halt execution of the function stack and output the contents of a specific variable. Now, in this case, what's happening is the loop is running through this list of restaurants one at a time. And as it goes to each new restaurant, it's taking that and it is temporarily storing it in a variable called item. So as the loop iterates through that list, for each restaurant, we temporarily have it available in that run, in that item variable. So for stop and debug, I want it to just halt execution and show me the contents of item. So what this means is we're going to call the API. We have the list. The loop is going to run through the first iteration, but it's going to stop right there. It's not going to run through the rest because we're telling it to stop before it continues. So we can look at the contents of item. And then we can also leverage that to make building the rest of the steps of the loop a lot easier. So we'll go ahead and save that, and we will run this again. Okay, so now we have our item variable here, and this is all of the data related to a single restaurant. You can see there is a whole lot of data here that we are not using. If you recall, our restaurant database table really only has a name and a description and a location. So it looks like we have the city and state inside of this address object. We have the name of the restaurant. Oh, looks like it's right there. And we have our description right there. So those are the only pieces of information we actually need. So what I'm going to do is the first thing I need to do is make sure that this data is formatted in the way that I need it to be. Let's check this data and see what we actually need to change. So I can see here that address in our table in Xano, it's just a text field with a city and a state. However, this API is returning a whole address object with a bunch of other data that we don't need, and the city and state are actually separate. So I need to combine those together. So let's use a create variable step. I'm just going to call this city state. And for our value, we're going to hit the copy button here right next to stop and debug. And what this will allow me to do is I can hover over the item variable and click subpath, and I can paste what I just copied right in that box and click define. And so now Xano gives me a super easy point and click interface to get the exact data that I need. So we're going to start with the city, but remember we need the state here as well. So I'm going to leverage a filter for this. The filter is going to be called concat, which just takes two values and mashes them together into one. So we use concat. The value is again going to come from item, and I'm again going to use that subpath feature. And we are going to dial down to our state. Now we need to define a separator, which is just a comma and a space. So we'll go ahead and update that. And we'll save. We can also use stop and debug to check and make sure that we did everything right. Let's take a look at the contents of this variable. So all I've done was move stop and debug down below the create variable, and I'm going to change the variable that we are outputting. We'll click rerun. And so our stop and debug has been triggered, and you can see we now have our city and state. So going back to our stop and debug on the item variable so we can continue to get the data that we need out of here, let's take a look at the description. So we just have a very simple text string with a description here. So it doesn't look like we actually need to make any modifications to be able to add this to our table. So that means we can move down to the restaurant name, which is just another text string. So that's really all we need there, which means that we are ready to add this data to our database. And we're going to do that with a database request and an add record. So we're going to add this to our merchant table. So we have 5 fields that we can populate here. We don't need to populate the ID. Xano will auto increment that ID for us. We'll leave the created at as it stands. So this is just going to add the whatever time it is now into our table as that created at value. And now here's where we start pointing it to the actual restaurant data. So we will be pointing it to the item variable. Again, remember that item is the single restaurant that the loop is running through. And again, we'll use subpath, paste that response. And we will use the interface to dial down specifically to the restaurant name. We're going to do the same with the description. There it is right there. And now for the location, remember we had to construct that city and state value. We'll just go ahead and point that to our city state variable instead and click save. Now, I believe all of these restaurants are going to list the same location. I'm not sure how wide the radius is. We're kind of doing this live, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. So let's go ahead and disable our stop and debug. You could move the stop and debug down below the add record and look at the output of that, but I think we're going to be okay. I'm pretty sure this is going to work. So we're going to run this one more time, and then we're going to go check our table for all of that new information. Okay, so that has completed executing. We've received a success. Now let's go over to our database table. And remember, we only had a couple of restaurants in there when we were adding them manually. So let's see how many we have now. So there is all of our new restaurant data. It looks like some of them maybe didn't have descriptions, so that's okay. But the point is that we can see all of that information was populated from data in that API. Let's change up our location just so we can really kind of drive home exactly what happened here in a very short period of time. So I'm just going to update my URL with a new latitude and longitude. We can save that. We'll go ahead and save. So again, going back to our table, we have 3 pages of restaurants now, but it looks like they are all in Chicago. So if this works, we should see an entirely different location. Okay, so we have another success. Let's go back to our table. We'll head to the last page. Oh, never mind. Here we go. Here is our new restaurants located in Santa Monica, California. Just like that. And all of this came from the API. And it looks like we even have a little bit of variation here. So we have some Los Angeles, some Venice as well. Very cool. And so now this, of course, means that this data is immediately available if we wanted to add some new deals to our database. Maybe the merchants themselves want to come in and add their own deals. You would have a lot of possibilities with something like this. But we can see I can very easily go ahead and start referencing that new restaurant list right away, just like we did before. We really want to thank you for taking the time to watch this From Idea to App series, where we took you through the very beginning journey of setting up your backend in Xano, to adding data to your database, to building your APIs and showing how they would be connected to a front end, and finally working with data from external APIs and services. We wanted to show you how straightforward and simple the process is, especially when you're first starting out. We understand how overwhelming the concept of building a backend can be, so we hope this gives you an idea of what that looks like. There's, of course, a lot more to learn, so feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions along the way, and we will see you in the next one.